Hello and welcome to the Correlosophy Podcast. This is episode 113. Are we doing anti-racism wrong? With Dr. Sheena Mason. With the rise of anti-racist discourse and initiatives, many people are unintentionally promoting racist ideas and missing opportunities to identify and celebrate functional diversity, or diversity of thought over perceived diversity, based largely on phenotype and social constructions. Dr. Sheena Mason is a PhD from Howard University who is now a professor at SUNY Oneonta in Oneonta, New York. She teaches African American literature there. For the last few years, Dr. Mason has been thinking about and working on the ways that we discuss race and racism in a way that she believes can move us in the right direction as a human race. Sheena and I discuss the ways these ideas could be the next evolution of race deconstruction in education and in culture. We also discuss how this can be accomplished without ignoring the injustice that has flown from the belief in race. It is well known by my colleagues and audience at this point that I've been very critical of certain race discourses as well, and how they function in our organizations, in our schools, and honestly between colleagues. I've put together my own thoughts that I will be bouncing off Dr. Mason in this episode, but my own thoughts that are possibly signs that some race activism may be misguided. So you can think of these as if the shoe fits, wear them. Does the activism or the policy insist that racial categories are real, useful, or impossible to rid ourselves of, making it seem as if the way the person looks is the most important part of their contribution? Does it seem to shy away from the celebration of progress? Does it treat the world as if it is a fixed pie through the use of reductionist racial category quotas, usually with very broad terms like black, white, brown, indigenous, or even worse, a racial binary, white and non-white? Does it confuse or conflate real phenomena such as culture, class, ethnicity, and ancestry with the fiction of race? Or does it treat those co-equal humans as avatars for a racialized group? This is a meaty one, this is a heavy one, but I think it's very important, and I think you're going to be refreshed by Dr. Mason's way of explaining in a scholarly way how some of these concepts have real meaning for us in our lives and in our choirs and organizations and classrooms. If you want to have your state organization, your regional organization, or your school district or your school be correlosified, the easiest way to do it is to go to correlosophy.com and look in the top menu and you will find a clinician request form. I would love to join you, so reach out and let's set something up. Since my summer presentations are over, the Patreon just got a big dump of goodies in the Google Shared Drive because I put all of my presentation slideshows on Patreon for member-only access. But you've got to be on the Patreon to actually have my slides. And so the best way to do that is to go to patreon.com/correlosophy. For less than a cup of coffee every month, you get access to the extra episodes there, as well as the extra content. The producers over at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Chandler Smith, Vasquez Academy of Music, John Warner, Ulrika Egrain, Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, Jeff Wall, Stephen Kathy Kukacik. Right. Okay, everybody, I am here with Dr. Sheena Mason, and we are going to have a fascinating conversation, I just know it, about the ways that we talk about and think about race and racism, especially in the American context. And I'm really excited because I'm a big fan. Welcome to the show, Dr. Mason.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to talk with you.
So I'd like to just start out with you talking to my audience just a little bit about who you are, like even just the little Sheena, going a little bit back into how did you come to be doing what you are doing now, and what is that?
Wow. Well, that's definitely a fun question to answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I earned my doctorate last year from Howard University in English literature, and I specialize in African American, American, and Caribbean literature. And I came to love literature primarily because as a child, I experienced severe child abuse and neglect, and I read voraciously. I had the good fortune of having access to any book I could have wanted, courtesy of a local library. And my escape was school and reading. And so that love for reading manifested itself as an undergraduate when I was initially a psychology major, thinking I'm going to somehow have a positive impact on the world by helping probably young people go through and process traumas such that I myself had experienced as a counselor or something to that effect. But my love for literature kept calling me. And at the time, I had a professor who specialized in African American literature. And I was learning a lot about racism and what people call race in American society. And I felt this connection to the literature, both because I had experienced explicit racism growing up, and also because I experienced the transformative power of literature. I put a lot of value in what literature brings to the world and what writers can generate through just writing. And I wanted to be part of that. And so now as a professor, I get to give that gift to my undergraduates at SUNY Oneonta, New York State. And as an educator, even outside of that context, I get to work with people and hopefully teach people a thing or two about this thing called race and racism through my theory of racelessness work.
So how was that decision arrived at in your life of where the literature is the passion, the literature is the educational pursuit, but then at some point you said, okay, so this race and racism aspect is going to be, for lack of a better term, my evangelist mission. This is the thing. This is going to be the thing I go out on the internet and talk about, and go on podcasts and talk about. How was that shift decided, and was there a catalyst?
Yeah, I would say that there wasn't a shift required, because if you know African American literature and how it's come to be taught and interpreted as always having to do with race and racism, there's an underlying or even overarching activist component to that body of work and to the study of that work. And in that sense, I think that's what pulled me to the literature, because I always believe wholeheartedly that I had a greater purpose, that I had gone through everything I went through for some bigger reason. Mm-hmm. And very early in my studies, I felt that that bigger reason had something to do with race and racism. And I could have had no idea, really what that was going to look like. But at the time, I imagined I was going to publish some books, right? I was going to have something positive to say and, put out into the world. And I imagined I would have a nonprofit youth center in an at-risk or underserved neighborhood. And it was that combination of activism, but then also education and sort of communal, outreach that I felt inclined to do all the way up until maybe a couple of years before I finished my doctorate, when I realized I think my purpose is even greater than that, right? And that's not to give short shrift to people who have nonprofit youth centers or anything like that, but I felt that the path I had been on and all of the expertise that I had built along the way, I took plenty of gap years between degrees, worked in corporate America. I taught 9th through 12th grade. I worked for nonprofits. I was like, all of that stuff can be combined into an endeavor that's even bigger. And I still didn't know what that bigger was, but I'm finding out increasingly what that is. And I'm optimistic that I will have a positive change, even if it's, after my lifetime, when people look back and they study what it is that I put out into the world.
Yeah, that's wonderful and very admirable. The question, though, I think, to maybe as a way to kick this off is, most of my audience will be familiar with concepts of anti-racism and activism and DEI work and, those types of things. But why do we need the theory of racelessness when Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi have already written books? So they've already taken care of this. So they've already solved racism. So why do we need your ideas?
Just like there can never be enough books about the Civil War, there can never be enough books working to solve the problem of racism, especially because the people you named and the vast majority of people who came before them, because it's not like Kendi or D'Angelo invented anti-racism. They might have dubbed it that, right? But they didn't invent it. I mean, you talk about Frederick Douglass as being one of the originators of anti-racism. The traditional way that people have fought against racism or have worked to solve racism has unintentionally resulted in the upholding of the same racism that they're trying to work against. And the primary reason for that is because up until this point, the majority of people, when trying to fight against racism, operate within race, right? Within racialized frameworks or racialized ways of seeing themselves and seeing other people. And in that way, it is my strong assertion that they are doing it wrong, and that the best way to be anti-racist is to be anti-race, to be against the belief in race. And that's what the theory of racelessness helps people, number one, identify, understand, and grapple with. What if the reason why it seems like we're regressing in a lot of ways as a nation is because we've been doing it wrong, right? And what if the way we've been doing it has taken us as far as it possibly can?
Yeah.
And in order to forge a better future for everyone, what if our belief system, what if our knowledge system has to have a radical change?
Absolutely. And it has seemed to me for quite a while, even before I came across you and your work, that it has seemed like the way we've decided to fight racism or be anti-racist in the last few years is to make race and to make the differences that are visible to our eyes and that are visible to our cultural meters, so to speak, to make those differences as important and highlighted and reified as possible. And that seemed to be to me to be like, why are we doing that? If the goal is if the goal truly is to eliminate racism, we would try to at least be pointing out progress. We would be pointing out our common humanity. We would be pointing out the things that are the same. We wouldn't be ignoring the differences and the injustices, but we would be. It's almost like, what do you choose to focus on? And so what I wonder too is that there will be people listening to this that they hear a theory of racelessness and they will think, oh yeah, we have another name for that. We call that colorblind racism. So how is it not that?
I'm sorry, it makes me giggle because you can imagine I get asked this question incessantly.
And I'll get asked this too when I publish the episode. So
exactly.
This is your chance to explain it.
Yeah. So a few things. Color blindness, for one, the premise of it is that I can see something about you, I can translate that into race, and then I can overlook that racial aspect of you and be a good human being and treat you how I want to be treated. That's the premise of color blindness. Now, the reason why that falls short for plenty of people includes the fact that the presumption is the existence of race. There's the presumption that skin color is race, that phenotype is race. But if you understand race and if you understand the genealogy, the history of race and racialization in any human context, then you understand that race is not skin color, it's not phenotype, it's not DNA, it's not culture. But because we've convinced ourselves that it's all of those things and more, it's also social and economic class, it's also ethnicity, everything under the sun is race, it has made it that much easier for racism itself to continue to hide its face in race. So that if you believe in the existence of race, if you believe that I am a racialized Black person, then unintentionally and often subconsciously, what gets carried with that is a whole host of presumptions about who and how I am based off of how you racialize me. And those presumptions have nothing actually to do with how I am, but I'm made to be the problem because essentially the way that we've talked about racism is as if people who are racialized as Black are the cause for the subsequent racism, right? It's my skin color that you see that you decide whether you like me or you don't like me, if I'm superior or if I'm inferior. And what the theory of racelessness works to do is to help more people stop that misdirection. Because so long as racism continues to hide its face as race, and we continue to conflate culture and ethnicity, social or economic class with race, then racism that's getting carried along that created the whole mythology of race in the first place also persists. And last time I heard, some people view colorblindness as a solution, mostly because they don't know that there's an alternative to colorblindness or upholding the importance of race, right? They don't know that there's a third option, that we could discontinue our belief in race in order to stop racism in its tracks, truly. But then also colorblindness falls short for a lot of people because of the ways in which we get racialized. Some people have a difficult time acknowledging the existence in the historical or contemporary instances of racism. Theory of racelessness is literally what people come to help liberate themselves from being the cause and from enduring the effects of racism. You can't point to colorblindness and say that that's what colorblindness effectively does, because it doesn't. That's what makes it so contentious, and that's what makes it a criticism from some people or praise from other people, right? When they hear theory of racelessness and misconstrue it as colorblindness. And the last thing I'll say too, and the last difference that I think matters, is colorblindness in and of itself is not a framework. Okay. It's not, people have ideas about colorblindness. They have aspirations to be colorblind, or they disagree with colorblindness, you name it. People have ideas about it, but the theory of racelessness is a teaching and interpretive framework. It is something that any person can learn the rules, the core tenets. They can learn the tools, the primary one being the race translator, and they can apply it across the board to be more clear-eyed and astute about what racism is, what it isn't, and to help stop the effects and being the cause of racism in its tracks, which again is something that colorblindness can't do, because it's still operating under the whole premise that race is real in some way, whether meaningful or not.
Yeah, that's really well put. And you mentioned the core tenets, and I think this would be a good opportunity to just lay those out. So if someone is saying, in a relatively packaged deal, what is the theory of racelessness? Then how do you respond?
The core tenets are that race does not exist in nature, nor does it exist as a social construction. Everyone is thereby raceless. Racism includes the belief in race as something biological or as something constructed, and the act or practice of racialization. Racism is not everywhere and is not the cause for every perceived negative interaction, and racism can be overcome. Ultimately, the core tenets lay out the philosophies of race that underpin the theory of racelessness, that are seldom taught and commonly misunderstood, if a person ever even learns about them in their entire lifetimes. That's how excluded from education and media these philosophies are. But the reason the philosophies become really critical is because it helps people come to themselves outside of the strictures of racism, so that when best understood, when properly understood, the theory of racelessness becomes synonymous with racismlessness, right? Limitlessness, being without racism and being human, right? Which we all are. But when you understand the impact of racialization, that's a dehumanizing process for every single one of us. So the theory of racelessness helps people to come into and recognize other people's humanity. And from that point, we can talk about the history, we can talk about the contemporary stuff, we can not accidentally see racism everywhere, because we're taught to see race everywhere because we see skin color, for example, everywhere. Um, and in that way, we can be more clear-eyed about what the solutions are when we do identify racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about some of those examples, because I'm interested to hear your historical perspective. You mentioned the history of this, but it is my understanding, and feel free to tell me if I've had this wrong. But it's my understanding that the very concept of race was invented, I will oversimplify for the sake of time, but was invented essentially to justify the continued practice of slavery. And where slavery, of course, had been going on since the beginning of humankind. But then we get to around the Enlightenment, and people are starting to be like, I don't know if we should own slaves. And so then we had to create this new framework where it says, oh, it's okay to own these people as slaves because they're in a different category. And then we had to create these categories, and downstream from that we have race. Is that wrong, or am I narrating that okay, do you think?
I think if we're going to limit our discussion to just the context of what would then become and what has since become America, that's correct.
Okay.
I would just, and I say that because the idea of race existed in early modern Europe. It existed in the Roman Empire. It really has existed across different civilizations. And where it exists, it has always been a device to subjugate, to marginalize and exclude and oppress one group in favor of another group. And so when the Europeans came over to what would become the United States, that handy dandy category of race already exists, except it looks a lot different in the European context. But they take that concept of race and then they just recast it. They reconstruct it to fit what was already on the ground, which is, as you said, chattel slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And something important of what you said too is even slavery was more complex than what we're taught to believe, right? Because you had indentured servants who were of European descent, which means that we would racialize them as white now, but they were in effect enslaved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when that labor pool was sort of threatened by the well-to-do Europeans, they say, okay, we have this other labor pool to tap into, right? So indentured servitude gets phased out, and that's where Africans and indigenous people were enslaved. And then that's when people become Black or they become white. And if you were a free person and you are of African descent, you are a free person of color. So your status, whether enslaved or not, and then where you came from, was what led to your racialization. And there was a distinction between just being of African descent and being free, or being of African descent and being enslaved. And that's where the sort of birth of Blackness, right, and the birth of whiteness in the ways that we now think of it, however many centuries later, that's where those concepts derive. And that history and acknowledging it and really grappling with it, I think is such a critical part to understanding why somebody like Sheena Mason comes along and says, we're doing it wrong, right? Because we've tried really hard to write humanity into a category that is Blackness, in which it was never intended to include as human. Mm-hmm. If you were Black, you were property, you were a beast, you were chattel, right? So since that time, for abolition, through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement, through the Black Lives Matter movement, people have been trying to write humanity into a category that was written from the beginning outside of humanity. Yeah. And I'm saying, hey, this ain't going to work, right? It's just not going to work. Because if it was going to work, then I think after this many centuries, it would have worked. But let's try this new thing because we haven't tried this other thing before.
I want to remind you all that student travel is something that I think every teacher and every program needs to have as a goal. DCINY, Distinguished Concerts International of New York, is a fantastic, high-quality opportunity. If you're thinking about a trip, New York has to be at the top of the list. And if that is the case, then I want you to go to dciny.org and check out their various concert offerings to see if you can jump onto one, because they work well with you. They are awesome, and I think that they are a great company to work with, and I encourage you to check them out. Before we jump in there, of course, don't forget you have a Correlosophy checkout code that gets you discounts at all kinds of really cool places. So don't forget to use it. Every single time you get sheet music at Graphite Publishing, every time you get sheet music at Ryan Main, put Correlosophy in the checkout. Get 10% off. Every time you get Sight Reading Factory, which is coming up soon, you're going to be renewing your Sight Reading Factory. You're going to be renewing your Sight Reading Factory memberships soon, right? You'd better be. And so that means when you get to that checkout page, you've got all your student memberships, your membership renewed, 10% off when you enter Correlosophy. And then you can do that every year, by the way. I've had some people say, oh, can I just use that once? No, you can use it every year. Please do. Okay. Also, when you go to mymusicfolders.com, don't forget to enter Correlosophy at checkout there when you're getting your folders, your singer's masks, if you live in a place that is going to have those coming back soon, or you just need an N95 to protect yourself because you've got an immune system issue. They have N95 grade singer's masks. So go there and get a discount with that Correlosophy discount code. So essentially, this other thing being that we can no longer continue to use these categories that were so damaging, and hope that suddenly we can use them for good all of a sudden. That maybe it's the categories themselves that are causing the problem. Is that a fair summary?
I think so. It's the categories themselves. It's the whole ideology behind what I call racialist thought and racialist practices. It's the whole kit and caboodle, right? It basically, in continuing to uphold and maintain that same ideology that derived from the earlier time period they were just talking about, and in continuing to not recognize how racialization in every context is always bad. There's nothing inherently positive about being racialized. Then we are missing countless opportunities to help stop maintaining the thing in the first place, and in that way free ourselves and our future generations from the thing that we inherited, right? Because truthfully, it's none of our faults that we've inherited this way of seeing ourselves. We get taught in elementary school at very young ages that there are different human races. So it's in there, it's baked in. It makes sense that we see ourselves in this way. And it makes sense why we continue to be divided along these superficial lines, and why digging in and elevating or privileging one's racialization is counterproductive.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that there's no way to, or no positive context in which someone could be racialized. But yet it seems that we're incentivized by the culture to be very proud. Some people, well, unless of course you're a straight white male, so I'm not proud of being that. But we are incentivized to be proud and be like to lead with racial categories in so many situations. So what would you tell a person who is very proud of what they think of as their race? Where are they going wrong?
Well, what I would tell that person, and what I would tell a person who doesn't see themselves in that way, is that it's not racial. What's happening there gets interpreted as race and as racial because the same language is used, that which is used with race stuff, right? Black. We talk about Black pride, right? Black power, Black excellence, Black girl magic, right? There's a specification that's happening there that gets interpreted as being racial, or even as being only racial, because that is a category that also is associated with a race, right? But part of what my framework helps people do is to see that same language and interpret it into more apt language, right? Like, a lot of times it's not a quote unquote racial pride, even as a person might assert that it's a racial pride because they've been taught to think of it in that way. A lot of times it's a cultural pride, right? Mm-hmm. But in American society, we're taught that race dictates or creates our culture. I would argue it's the other way around, that culture actually creates and dictates our belief in race. But so long as we have it twisted, we're going to continue to misinterpret what people are actually trying to communicate, and what we ourselves are even trying to communicate. And that misinterpretation is actually one reason why just 2 or 3 years ago, I went through a really painful period myself, because as I'm doing my doctoral coursework, I'm seeing things, right? My brain is gelling, and I get to a place of articulating at the earliest stages of what would become my theory of racelessness. And it was the phrase, it was something to the effect of, the literature is showing us that to undo racism, we have to undo race. And I remember crying in my advisor's office because I didn't want to, right? Everything was pointing in that direction. I had become a full-blown eliminativist. That is a person who argues that the category of race should be eliminated or erased. But I still saw myself from within that framework. I was a proud Black woman, and you couldn't tell me any different. And I went through a lot of, Lord of the Rings, Smeagol moments, talking to myself, feeling like I was actually going crazy because ethically I couldn't turn away from what I was discovering, right? And my advisor, bless her heart, she was pushing me like, you don't have to be the martyr, you don't have to stop calling yourself Black today, like just keep going down the path that your brain is sending you and write about it and share it with the world, right? But I felt like I was in a pickle because I saw the irony of identifying in that way, even as I saw the problems with that identification. And then I came to realize, everything I love about myself has nothing to do with race. It's not racial, right? It is cultural. It is ethnicity. It's who I am, how I look, my hair texture, right? Like it's my tenacity, my resilience. It's just the awesomeness that is Sheena Mason. I love all of those things about myself, and yet none of those things have anything to do with race. Because when you understand race and racelessness, then you understand that the only thing that's being removed from a person is the violence of racism. And the violence of racism gets thrust upon us in some ways, and we thrust it upon ourselves because we're using the same language to talk about other things that are meaningful, right? To talk about other things that do exist, to talk about other things that aren't as pernicious as white pride, for example. Because wherever you see that, it's all bad, right? Which is what you're saying. So it's like the more we can translate, and the more we can have freer imaginations in terms of how we think about ourselves and the language we use to describe ourselves. And if we can do that without upholding racism, right? If we can use other language, invent it, I don't care, right? Whatever it is. But if we can use other language, then we can get outside of the quagmire. And the last thing I'll just say is, and I hope this story is illustrating this, it just requires a lot of compassion and empathy and understanding from everyone's parts, right? Because I see a lot of people interpreting assertions of Black pride and that sort of thing as inherently racist and wrong-headed and ironic and all of the things. And I think there's something to critique there. But the thing to critique isn't the people espousing those ideas themselves in a way, right? It's like the idea that we can use language that derived from racism and this racist history and use it in a way that uplifts when there's nothing positive about being racialized, and we can get more creative.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because, of course, there you're pointing out the idea that someone might say they're proud to be Black, or they might say they're proud to be Latino or whatever, and then I might say, and I've had this conversation with a Black friend who I know well enough to where it was safe, that kind of conversation, and I said, so why are you proud to be Black? And she proceeded to describe a whole bunch of things, like kind of like you just listed. She started talking about the cookouts and church on Sunday, and like how much energy was at the family gatherings and all this kind of stuff. And I eventually said, that sounds to me like culture. Like what you're proud of is the culture that you were raised in. And she just went, oh yeah, that's right. I kind of am. And then that led us to a great conversation about how, well, of course, not every Black person shares the same culture. Like if you're Black Caribbean and or Black, what's like maybe from the Dominican and you grew up speaking Spanish, and then you show up here, you're going to feel like you're in a very different culture. Nigerian, of course. And then one thing that we don't talk about much at all is there are many, many white cultures across the planet too. And white is not a culture. White is not an ethnicity. And so it seems like you are what you're explaining is how people could and should think a little bit in higher resolution about all of what we tend to call race.
Yeah, because even the examples you gave are apt examples, but even in the context of the same state, you will have different cultures which people would perceive or label to be racial. But if you understand again the difference between race and culture, which is really important, then you understand that in a country like America where diversity is king, cultural formation is so complex that it really varies from region to region, place to place. What's called Black culture in Houston, Texas is not going to be the same as what Black culture is called in New York City, right? Like there are differences that get washed over in favor of some kind of avatar of what it is to be a racialized Black person in the United States. But then also Americans, I know, tend to think that that's worldwide too, like as if there's a single way to be a thing. And that's one of the underlying pernicious aspects of racialization, is it really washes over differences that are meaningful, and it washes over similarities that are meaningful. Because whatever your racialization is, you can participate in culture, especially in the American context, in very complex and different and diverse ways. And I know very few people who fit into any one box as it pertains to their cultural inclinations, But there's this really kind of evil is the word I want to use, but that's hyperbolic. There's this really limiting idea that there's a way to be Black or there's a way to be white. And that's the kind of thing I'm pointing to and saying that's racism in disguise. Because if you understand humanity, if you understand cultural formation and national formation, none of that is true. But we segregate even how we think about how ourselves and each other should be. And then we reinforce the divisions that we should readily reject at this point, especially in 2022. I'm here for something different, Chris, because I'm over it. I'm over this, the divides and all of that. I'm over it.
I'm right there with you, Sheena. I totally agree. I would like to take this conversation in one more direction, if it's okay, which is to talk a little bit. A lot of my audience are educators, and I'd like to talk about this concept in the context of schools, because, of course, as you know, these are hot button topics in education also, in that many of our school districts and universities and really every level of education are being guided more and more by DEI committees, diversity, equity, inclusion, those types of things. And much of what gets said in those types of conversations on its face is admirable and super exciting. But then the longer I tend to listen to them, and I've been in public education for 20 years, the longer I hear about them and the new rules that we will be following and the new language we will be using, I tend to find it more and more like it's making this race concept even more real. And seems to be the opposite of a lot of the things that you're saying. Have you noticed that too? And what is your answer for that?
Yeah, it's really ironic because some very well-intended people are making the concept of race and our belief in race realer because they are trying to make realer cultural differences, right? What they perceive to be ethnic differences and social and economic class differences, as well as racism itself. So we have a lot of people who are under the belief that, or under the impression that to do that, we have to emphasize race, right? And you have to acknowledge and embrace my race. And we also know that there's an increasing amount of literature out there that's disproving the effectiveness of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which are really all embracing this type of thinking, this sort of digging into and deepening how we racialize ourselves. So it's my sincere hope that more people will hear about my work. I'm not alone in this space. I'm the person who created the thing that's called theory of racelessness, of course, but there are plenty of other people who are in the racelessness space. And I look forward to people not misconstruing what that means, and being open to other more effective solutions. Because if we continue down this path, we will have a future of generation after generation after generation of people still fighting within the quagmire and the machinery of racism itself to fight racism itself. And it's a losing battle. It's a losing battle by design, right? Because that's what racialization does. That's the outcome. It'll keep us in this battle forever. And it doesn't have to be like that. So we can, contrary to popular belief, and mind you, a lot of people the theory of racelessness didn't exist until I created it. So a lot of people just don't know that there are other ways to think about this thing, right? But there's a way that we can address meaningfully historical and contemporary instances of racism without upholding racism. We can make for young people the reality of racism, right? And we can also point them in a direction to a future where racism isn't a thing anymore, not in the ways that it has been for too many centuries. And we can make real for young people differences with cultures, right? And different ethnicities. We can do all of the things that the sort of traditional anti-racist or DEI, practitioners are trying to achieve. And that's influencing different curriculums without being part of the problem. Right.
Right.
But we have to choose to do that. And that means that we have to be open. We have to have an open heart and an open mind to the very real possibility that the DEI trainings and the different ways that they're finessing our curriculums is ineffective because racialist ideology and maintaining that type of racialization is worsening the same problems you're trying to address.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let me frame it this way, and I want to see what you think. So in schools, in school versions and big organization versions of DEI, which is where most of my experience is because I live in that world, they seem to have bought into the idea. It's kind of a Kendi idea where the disparity that we see in various measurements in education is all the evidence you need that racism is existing in that space. And because there's a disparity in, say, test scores or student discipline statistics or whatever, then that's your proof of racism. And the way we would then solve that racism is by making those disparities go away and doing whatever manipulation we have to do to the data and to the policies to make it look on paper like it's equal. And so what it seems to me, though, is, and maybe from hearing this conversation, what I'm picking up from you is that those might be downstream effects of some things that are racism and some things that aren't racism. And that could all be very well true, but we're not going to solve the racism part as long as we keep believing that race exists and is real in some kind of meaningful way in the first place. We have to end race before we can end racism. Is that fair, or did I switch it?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And I would just add that part of the problem. So I did Teach for America in 2012. I was a Houston Core member. So I taught 9th through 12th graders. And since 2018, I've worked for Freedom Summer Collegiate, which is an organization that does work in the Mississippi Delta primarily. And when you talk about really underserved communities and communities that are still feeling the lingering effects of, yes, racism, I think of the Mississippi Delta probably first. And I know that part of the achievement gap is influenced by racist ideas of educators and administrators about the children,
Yeah.
right? And I think the way that you don't solve that is by deepening their belief in race,
Yes,
and then
exactly. Yeah.
lowering standards and doing all of the things that we see happening around the nation with increased frequency that is alarming. And Roland Fryer has done some amazing work. And I had the privilege of being in his presence recently where he did a presentation. And that was the first time I was being presented with any of his work. And one thing he spoke about in his success of closing the achievement gap in just 3 years at the schools that he had gotten into was they brought every existing staff member and teacher into the interview room. And if they said that the kids can't learn, they didn't keep their jobs. And if they said the kids can learn, I just need professional development, or I just need the right tools, the right resources, the right direction, whatever else, and they kept their jobs. And those teachers and administrators successfully following his 5 simple rules, simple rules, they closed the achievement gap. They did the unthinkable, the thing that people say can't happen, right? With a little bit of, or a lot of bit of elbow grease. And so it's really paradoxical to me to see that in more and more schools, we're teaching the educators who might already have some kind of underlying bias. And some people might hear me say that and say, oh, not all racialized white teachers are racist. Well, something important to add to the discourse is the fact that teachers who aren't racialized as white, who are racialized as Black, still have the same bias oftentimes about their own students. And I've witnessed it, right? And my students have articulated that to me. So that's all because racialist ideology is inherited by all of us. So it impacts all of us in ways that we sometimes can't even measure or access. And I think about the bias that we're reinforcing unintentionally with every educator now, increasingly in the States. And I think about the impact that that's going to have on the kids. And I think about what if the solutions looked this way, or what if the solutions look that way? What if anyone paid attention to what Roland Fryer is doing in schools? Everyone would be winning.
Yeah.
Everyone would be winning, and especially the kids. But right now, I can't say with sincerity that our kids are winning right now. They're not winning because we're passing on to them the same, vile ways of dividing ourselves that we inherited. And I think it's wrong. And I hope to be a positive influence to do something differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, do you have any, do you do any work or create any resources that would be relevant for teachers or in a school context? Is that something that you've dipped your toe into at all?
Well, I'm creating an e-learning platform for the theory of racelessness right now. And the first course that we're going to launch in the fall is going to be the foundational course to help people grapple with what is the theory of racelessness and what knowledge is underpinning these conclusions and the tenets. And then from there, we're going to launch a DEI and an educators program. and people will be able to get certified in the theory of racelessness way. But that's probably going to be spring 2023 launch. So in the meantime, people just have to be patient as I'm writing my second book, which is going to be a book for everyone. The first book was a scholarly text, and developing this e-learning platform. But there's hope too, because I'm on the advisory board for FAIR, and I'm going over and giving feedback on their new ethnic studies curriculum. So I will have my hands in that, but it's not going to be 100% my brainchild, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. That's great. That's great. Yeah, I think about this stuff a lot because I feel like as an educator, and I mentioned before, I'm about 20 years into teaching, and I've taught probably 3,000 students in my life. And what I have started to learn and notice is that using words to categorize kids like Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, all these types of things is so low resolution. It's like looking at the world as if it were Minecraft with all those like pixels, and it just like with no detail at all, no ability to see the individual kid. I mean, like we've talked about several times, it's like, what does Black mean? Well, in the context of the United States, that means a lot of different things. Globally, it means almost infinite numbers of things. And so if I know a kid's Black, what do I know about them? I know very little. And as an educator, I'm the one that makes eye contact with those human beings like every day. I'm there with them every day. And so to me, I'm thinking, why is this the critical information that I have about this kid? Why don't I know, why am I not getting information about maybe culture? Why socioeconomic status? Those types of things seem to me that like those are things that actually make a difference in who that kid is. And ultimately, nothing is a substitute for just seeing the individual person. Like, who are you? What makes you tick? What kind of music do you like? I'm a music teacher, right? So do I have kids that are, I mean, I have tons of kids of every race, quote unquote, that are super into Korean music. Like that's like all the kids are into Korean pop music right now. None of them are Korean. So like, well, why do we care? I'm all for it, whatever, so I think this is really important stuff.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday who is supporting my work, and she was telling me, why can't we have soul to soul, conversations? Why can't we have soul to soul relationships? She's like, why does it always have to be some kind of imposition of some kind of label or some kind of category, et cetera, et cetera? And that's the problem with racialization, because it really does encourage far too many people to see people as avatars for their own respective races, in quotation marks, and that just belies reality, because that's not how any of us actually are. And so what does it look like to pass on to our young people a knowledge about the time when we racialized, right? But also give them indication that they don't have to choose that same path going forward. They don't have to see themselves in that same way, right? And they can still be good people, and give them a toolkit to do that. Because I just think so many of us want to be seen as the wondrous humans that we are, right? And it's really paradoxical to me, because a lot of people want to be seen as the humans that they are, but then they're operating within these frameworks that really preclude people from seeing their humanity.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be like that. So I look forward to doing more work, especially in the curriculum space, because of the necessity of it.
Yeah.
And it's going to take some courageous schools, some courageous educators to take a step in this direction, because I think peer pressure is a thing, and there is this sense of fear that I get from people that they don't want to be found to be or thought to be on the wrong side of this thing called racism, right? For example.
Yeah.
And as such, I think that has people fearful of trying anything that's presented as a quote unquote alternative. So one thing I like to emphasize too is that my work didn't derive having anything to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, or anti-racism as it has recently become popularly known. None of this was a result of me responding to that, right, and trying to fix the problem or something of that nature. This was a result of 20 years of studying, researching, observing everything to do with race and racism on a global context, and more specifically, a hyper focus on what happens in America.
Mm-hmm.
And that has meant that I've studied how people have responded to the thing, how people think about the thing, you know, sort of social scientist by accident, but also I do think it's my life's purpose. And the result of my deep study and understanding of all things race and racism is what led to the creation of the theory of racelessness. And the fact that it has applicability in a broader, realm or in really any industry or space or place where race and racism are being addressed or where people think it exists, it's just a happy happy accident. I was not responding to Kendi or D'Angelo or any of them.
Right.
And so I almost think people shouldn't think of it as an alternative. They should think of it as true anti-racism with the word race right in there to indicate the difference between what I'm advocating and what virtually everyone else is advocating.
And anti-race -ism.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of and as we wrap this up, I just want to say that I obviously I'm a kindred spirit here. I'm supporting the work that you do, and it's wonderful. I think the one of all of your tenets that makes me the most excited is the last one, which is the optimism that comes in when you say racism can be overcome. Like so few anti-racists will offer that as a possible outcome, because of course then they'd be out of a job. Right. So, but just the idea that like, okay, in theory, we could get to the end of this. There is a framework for us to, maybe it's my grandchildren's time, maybe it's their grandchildren's time, but there is a time that we could work through this.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. It is what has given me this like fierce sense of optimism myself. It's because I really believe that everything is possible. And I believe that for a lot of reasons, namely that I have overcome myself tremendous adversity and I didn't become a statistic. And actually, I'm kind of nailing it. Like every goal I've had, I've not just achieved it, I've transcended it. So I have this inner belief that everything is possible, which I think is also what helps me be that much of an overachiever. And so it's no surprise then that I approach a problem as ginormous, such as racism, as something that can be overcome. Yeah. I think that's one of the pernicious aspects too of how we currently talk about and think about this thing, is that it can't be overcome. It's omnipresent, it's everywhere. There are complex reasons for why people think that way. And we might have some sense of agreement in the sense that I don't believe we can reach utopia on Earth. I recognize that there are plenty of other ways that we will continue to divide ourselves amongst ourselves. But I do think racism, as we now know it in America, the sort of black and white, right? Or better put, black versus white. I think that can indeed be ended and overcome. And whether it takes one person at a time over a very long period of time, I think that our grandkids, as you said, or our great grandkids, I think they're going to be the ones who really, really get it and really, really benefit from our courageousness now. But it takes more people knowing first and foremost. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And then also being morally compelled in some ways to pursue a different path forward for everyone.
Yeah. That's what it's going to take. Well, Sheena, this has been lots of fun. I really appreciate this conversation, and the work that you're doing is incredible. What are the best ways for people to reach out and find you? And I'll put all these links in the show notes, but why don't you talk to us about it?
Sure. My website is one of the best ways, www.theoryofracelessness.org. Links to all of my social media, my podcasts, and my publications are on that website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been a blast, and I'm sure I'll see you out there in the wild on Twitter at some point soon.
Thank you so much, Chris. Be well.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. I hope you enjoyed that, or at the very least, got something out of it. Maybe it threatened you. Maybe it made you feel attacked. Maybe it just left you scratching your head because of all the big words. All of those things are valid responses, but I think these are important ideas for us to start wrapping our mind around. At the very least, opening ourselves up to the validity of having the conversation. Are we able to engage with people who have different philosophies about these types of things? I think that's important. So if you appreciate these types of conversations, or all the various types of conversations that you hear on the Correlosophy podcast, of course, go to Patreon, patreon.com/Correlosophy, and subscribe for $3 a month or more. But you can jump on there for as little as $3. And of course, use your promo code at ryanmain.com, graphitepublishing.com, mymusicfolders.com, and of course, sightreadingfactory.com. Don't forget to go to dciny.org and check out their stuff, and leave likes and shares and ratings and comments. This episode ought to draw some comments because it's thought-provoking. Thanks everybody for listening. See you next time.